What is there to say about Morrowind that hasn't already been said? People talk a lot about the fact that it doesn't hold your hand through quests with quest pointers, instead, giving the player directions which the player has to use their own head to navigate through the world. In general, I think a lot of the love of Morrowind is the challenges that it gives to the players to come up with their own solutions. The game really allows the player to make mistakes and mess up the time continuum in game destroying ways. There's also no quest log, there's a journal, but that's all you're gonna get by way of keeping track of quests. It leaves a lot of the thinking in the player's hands. But that's something that people talk about all the time. What people, I don't think, talk about as much about with the game, or at least I don't hear about it as much from a game design perspective. The game not only challenges the player to find their own solutions, but it actually subtly pushes the player to think outside of the box and even take advantage of the core mechanics of the game. In other words, Morrowind is a game which not only allows a player, but actually encourages them to break the game. I think that's a unique trait among games of the past and games of today, and it's definitely an interesting design choice. One that we probably won't see on such a scale as Morrowind ever again, I would guess. So first off, the game really challenges the player to think outside of the box in many situations and requires them to apply game mechanics in novel ways that aren't immediately obvious. For instance, let's take example House Telvanni, basically a Morrowind-specific government sect of ancient murder wizards for the uninitiated. When you're playing Telvanni, you'll realize quickly that walking normally isn't going to cut it. The Telvanni live in giant towers with no staircases. You're expected to fly. I thought this is a great way of, one, alerting the player that they better get to know their magic spells a bit better, because there is literally no way to play this game, faction, without at least a levitation spell. But also, two, this faction is so detached from normal reality of the rest of the game world that they literally offer no access points to any people without any magical inclinations. There is no way for a regular person that does not know magic to speak to one of the Telvanni counselors. And this is just a fact of the game world, but it's also not fully explained to the player as they go through the game. It's something they're going to have to pick up. So not only are they difficult to find and join, as they are literally on the opposite side of the island from every other major seating guild, they're the most remote of the three houses, and you only get to pick one of the three houses. So if a person playing the game for the first time, at least, is very unlikely to choose Telvanni as their house. And by the time they learn about Telvanni, it might even be too late for them. The Telvanni cities cannot even be accessed by Silt Strider. Silt Striders are the first introduced and main form of transportation for the player in Morrowind. You gotta take a boat, or you have to take a Mages Guild teleportation to Sadrith Mora. And it's this kind of hard-to-reach attitude of the Telvanni that I think is kind of a gateway to the Morrowind somewhat hidden way of thinking, where there are just many big things in the game, big aspects, that a player can absolutely miss on their first or on their fifth playthrough because they're just so hidden away from the main game. You just kind of have to know about them. But they're not little Easter eggs either. They're big parts of the game. Elder Scrolls games are famous for pushing players to think deviously. Theft is a crime in the real world and the game, but it's also a core mechanic of the game. You can steal from any NPC in the game, either from their house or right off their person. By now, this is such a common mechanic in games that it's hardly worth mentioning, but It's another glimpse into the devious mindsets of the designers of the game. At the time, I think it wasn't totally novel, but I think that was kind of on the cutting edge of pushing game mechanics to begin with. But now we can get into the really devious mechanics which do exist in Morrowind. In the game, there are vendors all over the place, in every city and of all sorts. As the player progresses, they will quickly learn that there are many items which can be acquired, magical artifacts, etc., which are worth so much that there is literally no vendor in the game who will be able to pay the player's full price for the item, and will only actually be able to pay a mere fraction of the price of the item. Most merchants only have a few hundred, up to maybe a bit over 1,000 gold. But then when you get your first glass item, and it's worth like 45,000, or a Daedric item or something, you'll be immediately like, how am I going to sell this thing? And the first instinct that a normal rule-abiding player would have would be that, oh, I'm not. The game just has intrinsic limits for how much money the player can make, and this is probably made into the game to kind of ensure that the player doesn't get too rich too fast and just break the game. This is a reasonable assumption, but it's also an incorrect assumption, as there are secret merchants in the game. The Creeper Demon, located on the second floor of a derrick building in Caldera, has 5,000 gold to work with. So already, with this not easy to find, out-of-the-way merchant, but not difficult to find either if you're thorough and looking hard, you can find one of the richest merchants in the game who will be able to give you 5,000 for any item. And then there's a mud crab located on a nondescript island in the middle of nowhere, which has 10,000 off the player. And this one's pretty hard to find, but with a little prior knowledge, the player basically has inbuilt game mechanics to bypass the artificial or superficial limit of the poorer common vendors of the game. So you can get full price for these expensive Daedric items by properly exchanging valuable items back and forth to the merchants, giving a knowledgeable player access to very large sums of money early in the game. And this is built in the game. This is not taking advantage or exploiting bugs. This is designed into the game, but it's just hidden. And it's this kind of hidden extra level of gameplay which I think is very interesting about Morrowind. So, having extra money in the game is a huge advantage because the game uses random chance to dictate players' ability to use basic skills, and those are only improved through the level you have in the skill. And most skills will be very low in the beginning of the game, making it very unlikely that you'll succeed in doing much of anything with most of your skills early on in the game. But you can use money to pay the trainers, so if you have a big wallet, you can level up your skills and make them actually usable. So having money early in the game is a really big advantage. But the devious of the developers does not end there. There is even more diabolical design mechanisms hidden in Morrowind, taunting the player to find ways to break the basic limitations of the game. Here I'm talking about spells. If you play through the Mages Guild, the player would likely notice that there are many spells which can be purchased from ordinary vendors, which simply cost too much magicka to be able to cast. In fact, even if a player maxes out their intelligence, which is the stat that dictates how much magicka they have to cast spells, they will find out that the spells that they bought from these merchants are still too expensive for them to cast. They cannot possibly get enough magicka to cast these spells that they bought from these basic merchants. So why even include these impossible to cast spells in the game? Seems kind of pointless. Now, nobody will mention this. Nobody will talk about the fact that these spells require so much magicka that by ordinary means they're impossible to catch or cast. There are ways to increase the character's basic stats through other magic means. So no one tells you this, but you can use Fortify attributes to increase your magicka, increasing your intelligence, and then after casting Fortify attribute, then you'll have enough to cast these other spells. But they don't tell you that. They just sell you the spell and say, here you go. And it's only when you max out your intelligence stat would you even possibly realize that you never had a chance at casting it to begin with. But it does not stop at game mechanics. The quests also subtly urge the player to disobey orders. In the Fighters Guild, at some point, the player will begin taking orders from a corrupt leader in the guild. The game does not like telling you that they're corrupt, but if the player discusses this leader's orders with a different leader who happens to be on the other side of the map, they'll tell you they're corrupt, and they'll offer you an alternate route through the guild at this point. And there are many times when the player is kind of forced to consider whether the actions they're taking with their guilds are actions that they would want to take, either from a moral perspective, or maybe the reward is just not worth the finishing the quest. Some of the Telvanni quests will have you fetch magic items that are so powerful, and then they will barely give you any reward for completing them, and you don't have to complete them, so you can just not complete the quest, keep the item, and you're better off. So the game also intrinsically encourages the player to disobey the very leaders, the people who are giving them quests in the game. It's part of the writing. It's not just in the side quests. In the main story, it is revealed that the player is the reincarnation of an ancient hero, the Nerevarine, or the Nerevar. The Nerevarine was killed long ago, but the current living gods of Morrowind, the Tribunal, who worked with the Nerevarine long ago. Through the game challenges the very notion of knowing history, as there are 4 different accounts of the events presented in the game. In the widely accepted account, the first account, told by the Temple of Morrowind, the major religion, this is what they all tell the people. The Nerevar died in battle with Dumas, the leader of the dwarves under the Red Mountain. But as the main quest unfolds, the player learns there is a schism in the temple, and there's a sect of dissident priests who believe that it was not Dumas who killed the Nerevar, but the Tribunal itself, who coveted the dangerous artifacts the dwarves held, Kragenak's tools, which are the true source of the Tribunal's power. So now we have 2 different versions of what happened. Was it the dwarves, the dwarf leader who killed you in your past life? Or was it the Tribunal, the 3 living gods? Then you speak to Vivek. He's got a 3rd version of the events. He says it was your disciple at the time, Dagoth who killed you, actually. And the Tribunal simply took the Kragenak's tools and were corrupted by them, but they did not actually do the killing. So now we have 3 different versions of the events. We don't know which one. And then Dagoth himself, he says he was innocent and that you just murdered him. So there's 4 different versions of these events that transpired in the game, and it's just part of the game that it's up to the player to decide what version of the events was true. They'll never tell you which one is the true one. It's up to you to decide. There's no definitive answer to this. So I guess the ultimate question with this video that I'm making is all this smoke and mirrors just to annoy the player? What's the point of all this ambiguity? What's the point of all this encouraging the player to disobey the orders that the game itself gives, giving them game mechanics to override, specifically built into the game and designed to be overridden? Well, I think that the game designers realize that players will look for ways to push the system to the limits no matter what. And rather than try and railroad players into one way of playing, the game embraces this mindset, and it gently gives players opportunities to exceed the apparent limitations of the game, and also to question the orders being given as well, in the most subtle way possible. And it's this extra level of freedom and it's this extra level of exploration where you are truly rewarded for trying to look past the surface that makes Morrowind still relevant today, more than 20 years after its release. A game like that, a game where it's intrinsically hiding what the player should really be doing, nobody would greenlight that today. It's too annoying, it's too difficult to find the right answer. People wouldn't want to invest money in that today, I don't think. So on a scale of Morrowind, I don't think we'd ever see a game like Morrowind again in this day and age. But they did it with Morrowind. It's a game that's designed to push players' preconceptions. And ultimately, Morrowind is a game about the idea that, given enough knowledge and understanding of the game's mechanics, the impossible becomes possible.